So I want you to imagine, for just a second, that you run a sprawling, complex nightclub.
Okay, a nightclub. I am with you.
Right, and you hire a security team to stand at the doors. I mean, their entire job is to keep out the brawlers, the vandals, the people who make the space fundamentally unsafe for everyone else trying to just enjoy their evening.
Yeah, the bouncers. That makes sense.
Exactly. But now imagine if the legal system suddenly declared that the very moment your bouncer successfully breaks up one fight, you, the venue owner, are now financially responsible for every single other fight that breaks out anywhere in the building forever.
Oh, wow. That is a massive liability.
Right? If someone gets punched in the back room, you pay for it, simply because you tried to keep the front room safe.
Well, I mean, the logical response from any business owner in that situation would just be to fire the entire security staff immediately.
Exactly.
You would just open the doors, step back, and let the chaos reign. Because trying to stop the chaos is the exact thing creating your legal liability.
And that impossible dilemma right there, that is the foundation of the 26 words that created the modern Internet. Today we are diving into Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1994, which was a provision added later in 1996.
Right, the statute that basically rules that internet platforms cannot be held legally liable for the information posted by their users.
Yes, exactly. And in this discussion, I will be arguing that this law is an indispensable market-driven mechanism. It functions, precisely as intended to prevent the internet from devolving into either an unusable cesspool or, a heavily sanitized corporate space.
And I will be arguing that the economic reality of the modern internet has fundamentally broken the premise of that law. I mean, the authors of Section 230, they envisioned a vibrant, competitive, free market.
They did, yeah.
But I maintain that the reality of network effects has completely destroyed that market. And the result is these massive, unaccountable monopolies. So applying a 1996 statute, which was written for dial-up message boards, to today's global mega platforms, well, it leaves our democratic discourse incredibly vulnerable.
Okay, so to understand why this law even exists in the first place, we really have to look at the fatal legal flaw it was built to solve.
The Prodigy case.
Yes, the 1995 New York State Court case, Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy. So Stratton Oakmont was this brokerage firm, and they were running illegal pump-and-dump schemes.
Basically buying cheap stocks, hyping them up, and selling them before the whole thing collapsed.
Right, exactly. And an anonymous user on an online service called Prodigy posted a message exposing this fraud. So Stratton Oakmont turned around and sued Prodigy for $200 million.
In defamation?
$200 million. That was a staggering amount of money for a tech company back then.
It was ruinous. Now, the key context here is that Prodigy's main competitor at the time, CompuServe, did absolutely no moderation. They were just a digital Wild West, but Prodigy marketed itself as a family-friendly service. They actually used rudimentary software to filter out indecent content. And that is where the trap snapped shut, right? Because the judge looked at Prodigy's attempt to clean up their site and essentially said, well, because you tried to clean your house, you are now responsible for every single piece of dirt inside it.
Yes, because Prodigy engaged in some moderation but happened to miss this one specific anonymous post, the court legally classified them as a publisher.
Meaning they face the exact same ruinous liability as the anonymous user who actually wrote the post.
Exactly. It created this bizarre epistemological paradox in the law. Suddenly, a platform was incentivized to practice complete, deliberate ignorance.
Right, because if you do not look, you are not liable.
Exactly. And this happened right in the middle of a massive 1990s media panic about cyberpornography corrupting children. Lawmakers were absolutely terrified that platforms would look at the Prodigy ruling, drop all their family-friendly filters, and just refuse to moderate anything at all.
So Section 230 was drafted specifically to overrule that one judge.
Yes, specifically subsection C2. It explicitly protects platforms from civil liability for any voluntary good faith action taken to restrict material that is obscene, violent, or harassing. I mean, it basically allows the bouncers to do their job without bankrupting the nightclub.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the original intent of that legislation. Section 230 was championed by Senator Ron Wyden, who was a pro-regulation Democrat, and Representative Christopher Cox, a market-driven Republican.
An unusual alliance, for sure.
Very unusual, but their alliance was predicated on a very specific assumption. They assumed fundamentally that consumer choice would act as an automatic brake on corporate excesses.
Right. The theory was that if a service moderates too heavily, silencing legitimate voices, or if they moderate too little and the site gets flooded with spam, consumers will just walk away. They'll find a different service.
Yes. And we actually have to look at the statutory text itself here. Section 230 subsection B2 explicitly states that the policy of the United States is to, and I'm quoting here, preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the internet.
The vibrant and competitive free market.
Exactly. The entire mechanism of accountability in that law relies on competition. But my argument is that this market simply no longer exists, and it's because of the economic theory of network effects.
So you are suggesting that the sheer value of a platform is what prevents people from leaving?
Yes, precisely. I am saying the value of a platform like Facebook or Twitter, it is not in its software code. Its value comes entirely from its massive user base.
Right.
I mean, a social network with 50,000 users is largely useless to a global brand or a political campaign, right? But a network with 2 billion users, that is essential infrastructure.
It becomes a utility almost.
Exactly. As a platform gains users, its value grows exponentially. And this creates massive switching costs. People cannot simply find a different service because, well, they migrate to where their friends, family, and customers already are.
So they're locked in.
They are locked in. And this dynamic naturally drives out competition. It leads inevitably to massive consolidation around a tiny handful of platforms. When Section 230 was passed in the era of fragmented dial-up bulletin boards, lawmakers just did not anticipate the total centralization of the digital public square.
So the underlying economic mechanism that justified the liability shield has vanished in your view.
The market forces are gone. And the result is a terrifying concentration of power. Because these massive platforms are completely shielded from liability, unelected private executives possess, unilateral authority to decide who gets to speak.
You're thinking of high-profile bans.
Yes. Consider Twitter's decision to block a former president of the United States from their platform. Now, regardless of your political stance, you must acknowledge the immense, unaccountable power in that single action.
It was unprecedented, certainly.
A handful of CEOs altered the national conversation overnight. They wield the monopoly power of historical newspaper titans, dictating what information reaches the public, but they carry none of the traditional liability of a publisher.
Look, that concentration of power is undeniably profound. I give you that. But stripping away Section 230 is the wrong mechanism to address that power, because we really have to look closely at the alternative here.
Which is what, in your view?
Well, if you take that curation power away from private executives, it inevitably shifts to the government. And in the United States, relying on the government to dictate the boundaries of online speech is far worse, simply because of the First Amendment.
So you are bringing up the limitations on what the government can legally classify as unprotected speech.
Exactly. The courts interpret the First Amendment incredibly broadly. The government cannot ban speech just because it is offensive or vile or misleading. And this creates a vast ocean of what legal scholars call lawful but awful content.
Lawful but awful.
Right. I mean, I am talking about deeply virulent hate speech. I am talking about insidious conspiracy theories that tear communities apart. If you treat these platforms like public utilities or force them to operate under First Amendment standards, they legally cannot remove that awful content.
Because the government cannot dictate the removal of protected speech.
Right. They would be forced to host neo-Nazi propaganda, for instance.
So they would be compelled to carry the worst of humanity just to avoid viewpoint discrimination?
Exactly.
But private platforms, on the other hand, are not bound by the First Amendment. Section 230 empowers them to act as a shield between the user and the abyss. I mean, when you talk to the people who actually run trust and safety teams for major networks,
Right, the actual moderators.
yeah, they are not spending their days debating the fine nuances of political discourse. They are dealing with an absolute deluge of beheading videos, terrorism recruitment campaigns, and, organized harassment.
It is dark stuff.
It's incredibly dark. And Section 230 is the specific legal mechanism that allows private companies to scrub that horror from their servers without constantly being dragged into court by users claiming their speech rights were violated.
Yes, but
If you remove the liability shield, public officials naively suggest platforms will just be more careful. But the reality is, an internet with no moderation at all, it would be completely unusable.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered what happens when that lawful but awful speech directly threatens public safety?
How do you mean?
Well, it is one thing to say society must tolerate unsavory political opinions. It is another thing entirely when platforms are hosting and, crucially, algorithmically amplifying dangerous falsehoods.
You're talking about misinformation.
Yes. Consider the spread of anti-vaxxer misinformation. We have empirical evidence showing how the unchecked spread of demonstrably false medical data literally costs human lives.
Okay, yes, the harms are real.
Right. And if a traditional publisher prints a manual on how to mix a toxic chemical disguised as a pediatric medicine, they face massive legal consequences. So why should a tech platform face zero liability for allowing a demonstrably false, life-threatening conspiracy to spread unchecked across a network of billions of people?
I hear you. You are pointing to very real harms, but the legal barrier preventing accountability there isn't actually Section 230, it is the First Amendment again.
How so?
Well, the Supreme Court has explicitly ruled that lies in and of themselves are broadly protected speech. The only exceptions are when lies meet a very high, specific bar, like defamation, or direct incitement to imminent lawless action.
But the half-truths and bad interpretations of data that cause public health crises rarely meet the legal threshold for defamation.
They almost never do. So even if you repeal Section 230 tomorrow, those posts remain constitutionally protected. But let us just look at the actual mechanism of enforcement if we were to somehow make platforms liable for misinformation. We immediately hit an epistemological wall.
Which is?
Who determines what constitutes a dangerous lie?
Well, it forces the platforms to become the arbiters of absolute truth.
It does, and they are terrible at it. Let me give you a concrete example. Consider the former New York Times reporter who built a massive following during the pandemic by questioning official government COVID data.
I know exactly who you mean.
Right, now if you are listening to this, you might have strong feelings about this individual. A large segment of the population views his writing as a dangerous source of lethal misinformation, and they argue he should be deplatformed immediately to save lives.
But another segment views him as a crucial dissenting voice.
Exactly, a voice exercising necessary skepticism against institutional overreach. If you repeal Section 230, you do not solve that debate. You simply terrify corporate lawyers with the threat of endless litigation.
So you suspect they would default to the Prodigy model just to protect their margins?
100%. Repealing the law wouldn't magically result in perfect, nuanced moderation. It would recreate the exact trap from 1995. Platforms would face a strict binary choice. They either lock down their sites entirely, pre-screening every single user comment before it goes live,
Which completely ends the interactive, real-time internet.
completely ends it. Or they do absolutely nothing. They return to the Wild West model to claim they are mere conduits, not publishers. Changing Section 230 provides an enormous financial incentive for platforms to moderate less, not more. And that is the exact opposite of what the critics are trying to achieve.
I come at it from a different way. You are presenting a false dichotomy between the complete destruction of the internet and the absolute preservation of the status quo.
I don't think it's a false dichotomy, but go on.
Well, I am not suggesting we take a sledgehammer to digital infrastructure. But look, we currently have a democracy where a massive number of citizens are disputing clear empirical facts and accepting outright fabrications. And why? Because the digital architecture actively incentivizes engagement over truth.
The algorithm, sure.
Right. We cannot simply throw our hands up, point to the First Amendment, and declare the situation unsolvable. We must at least explore targeted legislative reforms.
Targeted reforms?
Yes. We need surgical carve-outs that address specific harms, like the algorithmic amplification of lies, without breaking the whole system. The fact that half of Washington wants platforms to restrict more content and the other half wants them to restrict less tells me the current balance is fundamentally broken for everyone.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
The idea of a targeted reform or a surgical carve-out sounds perfectly reasonable when, a politician is giving a speech. But we don't have to guess what happens when Congress tries to surgically amend Section 230. We already have the data. We just have to look at the 2018 amendment known as FOSTA SESTA.
The Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act.
Yes. Congress looked at a horrific, undeniable problem, sex trafficking, and they decided to create a targeted exception. They amended Section 230 to create civil and criminal liability exceptions under Title 18.
Right.
The goal was specifically to target platforms that facilitated the exploitation of trafficking victims. Now, you actually testified in the House in favor of a narrow approach to this issue, didn't you?
I did. I supported a targeted intervention because websites explicitly built to facilitate the sale of trafficking victims were using Section 230 as a shield.
Yes.
They were hiding behind a law meant for good faith moderation to basically run criminal enterprises. It was a clear abuse of the statute.
I agree with the intent, but let us examine how the mechanism of that carve-out actually played out in the real world. Congress cobbled together a jumbled piece of legislation that created an incredibly vague standard of liability. The law stated platforms could be held liable if they knowingly facilitated trafficking.
The word knowingly is tricky in law.
It is. Now think about how corporate lawyers interpret the word knowingly when federal criminal charges are on the line. The platforms panicked. The safest financial and legal move wasn't to hire thousands of human moderators to carefully screen dating forums. The safest move was to shut down the forums entirely.
They aggressively over-censored.
Massively. They purged innocuous personal ads, they banned marginalized communities, and they wiped out entire networks of digital communication.
Right. They swept up a massive amount of legal consensual conduct just to guarantee they wouldn't accidentally host a single piece of illegal conduct.
Yes, and the real-world consequence was devastating. Advocates for sex workers came forward with data showing that this so-called fix actually made life significantly more dangerous for the very people Congress was trying to protect.
Because they lost their digital safety nets.
Exactly. By driving consensual sex workers off of relatively safe, verifiable digital platforms where they could screen clients, the law forced them back onto the streets into much more dangerous, untrackable environments. The surgical digital carve-out collapsed under the weight of its own unintended consequences.
I see.
So my challenge to you is this. Can you name a single legislative carve-out, whether for misinformation, hate speech, or political neutrality, that wouldn't result in that exact same catastrophic overcorrection?
Well, it is a profound challenge. I will grant you that. FOSTA SESTA is a textbook example of how a clumsy legislative hammer causes immense collateral damage.
It really is.
Defining the boundary of a legal carve-out is extraordinarily difficult when you are dealing with billions of pieces of content generated every single day. But acknowledging the difficulty of the repair does not mean we should ignore the structural damage to the house. Let us go back to your nightclub bouncer analogy for a moment.
Okay, the bouncer keeping the venue safe?
Yes. But the bouncer isn't just standing at the door anymore. On a modern platform, the bouncer is actively dragging certain patrons to the center of the dance floor, handing them a megaphone and shining a massive spotlight on them, simply because their screaming keeps the rest of the crowd agitated and buying drinks.
That's quite an image.
But it is accurate. The premise of Section 230 was that platforms were merely conduits, passive pipes carrying water. But algorithmically driven mega platforms are not passive pipes. They are active, aggressive curators.
They organize the data, yes.
They use highly sophisticated proprietary algorithms to decide exactly what information is amplified to millions of people and what information is buried. When a platform actively boosts outrage and conspiracy because it increases user retention and advertising revenue, they are no longer just hosting content. They're fundamentally shaping reality for a profit.
But
to grant that specific business model absolute legal immunity based on a law written when people were logging onto AOL with that dial-up modem, is a profound failure of regulatory imagination.
Okay, but the curation aspect is vital to unpack here, because there is a deep misunderstanding about what an uncurated internet actually looks like.
A chronological feed?
Well, without curation, without algorithms picking, analyzing, and organizing content, an interactive computer service is just a chronological fire hose of raw data. It is unreadable noise filled with spam and bots. Section 230, specifically in its definition of an access software provider, explicitly protects the tools that pick, choose, analyze, digest, and organize content.
But they couldn't have imagined today's algorithms.
Maybe not the scale, but the authors understood that curation was absolutely necessary to separate the signal from the noise. If you penalize platforms for algorithmic organization, you destroy the utility of the network.
But they envisioned a market where users could choose between different curation models.
Right, competition.
Yes, if you didn't like how one platform organized your feed or what voices they amplified, you moved to a competitor with a different algorithmic philosophy. But when network effects consolidate the market into a duopoly, that choice evaporates. You are trapped in the specific algorithmic reality they design, and they face no consequences for the societal damage that reality inflicts.
It seems both of our arguments ultimately collide on the reality of centralization. I mean, the internet today relies heavily on a few massively centralized platforms. That economic reality severely complicates the original vision of the law.
Centralization really is the defining feature of the modern digital landscape. And I think it highlights that there are no easy, frictionless answers to the tension between open, democratic discourse and the dangerous spread of awful content.
There really aren't.
If you heavily regulate the space, you chill speech, invite government overreach, and push marginalized communities into the shadows. But if you do nothing, you empower corporate monopolies to algorithmically amplify the worst human impulses for profit without any accountability.
It is a delicate, perhaps impossible balance. As we wrap up our discussion today, I maintain my position that Section 230 remains the essential, load-bearing pillar of both the internet economy and the moderation systems necessary to make digital spaces usable.
The load-bearing pillar.
Yes. Without that specific liability shield, platforms face the impossible binary trap. Either censor everything to avoid lawsuits or moderate nothing and let the venue burn down. Those 26 words are the only legal mechanism keeping the bouncers at the doors.
And I maintain that relying on an outdated statute to grant blanket immunity to monopolistic tech giants leaves our democracy dangerously exposed. The bouncers may still be at the doors, but they are now guarding the only venue in town, answering to no one but their shareholders and aggressively dictating exactly who gets a megaphone inside.
Well, the material we've explored today offers a truly deep well of ongoing implications. The collision of free expression, economic monopolies, and digital architecture is perhaps the defining legal challenge of our era. There is so much more for our listeners to explore as society continues to grapple with these immense issues.
Absolutely. The internet is no longer just a novelty we visit. It is the fundamental infrastructure of our society. How we govern it matters immensely.
It all comes back to the venue. Are we creating a space that is safe enough to interact in, open enough to speak freely in, and competitive enough that no single owner can lock the doors on the truth? Think about the bouncers. Think about the megaphones, and ask yourself, who really holds the keys?